Hello and welcome to LarpWright. Today I'm overhauling an old Larp crossbow that a friend of mine gave me. The rubber's worn out, doesn't shoot really well with modern bolts, and it looks a bit plain. But it's a double crossbow, so you can fire two bolts at once, which makes it a fun toy to play with. So let's see what we can do. To start with, I disassembled the crossbow. Most of the parts were simply screwed together, but to my annoyance I needed like 3 different heads for my screwdriver to get all apart. The crossbow arms were not only screwed together with bolts and knots, but also glued to the frame, so it took a bit of violence and convincing to get them off, but I managed to do so without breaking too much. And I will be able to screw them back later on. Also, the nuts really stuck into the wood of the frame. The top and bottom part of the crossbow are glued together with wood glue. So I decided to use a lever to break it apart. And they were not only held together by wood glue but also by 2 wooden dowels, so it didn't break at the exact spot where it was glued back together, but it broke cleanly, and I was confident I could glue it back together later on. With the crossbow disassembled, it is time to grind off all of the paint. Using proper safety equipment, goggles, gloves, hearing protection, breath protection, and my trusted oscillating sander with coarse sanding paper. And I started removing the paint from the body. That took some time, but thanks to the magic of editing, you don't have to watch it all. There are these grooves to guide the bolt and hold the bolt in place, and I couldn't get in there with my belt sander or oscillating grinder. So I folded some sanding paper and also used the back of my vise here to sand it. Time to start with the reassembling. This spring was actually mounted the wrong way around and pinched the bolt into place way too much forward, so the lower bolt didn't have a lot of energy. What I'm going to do is I'm turning it around. There's actually a cutout, so it can move down, can be depressed. But for some strange reason it was mounted the other way around. Screwing it back into place. And this works. Now, to glue the frame back together, I'm applying a lot of wood glue to the breaking point. So I'm sure I have enough wood glue on there. Then I'm using a vise. It's also 2 pieces of wood to clamp it together, so I don't get any marks from the vise on the body of the crossbow. Wipe off any excess glue, because that will leave marks when I oil the wood later. I use a bit of damp cloth to get rid of
most of the glue. And then I can clamp it together and leave it to dry overnight. This is now dried overnight, and you can see where it was glued back together, but it's holding together good and strong. In my experience, the parts that are actually glued together won't break, but the wood around those will break, at least if you are using timber. I'm also sanding a bit more on the places where I wiped off the glue, just to make sure that there's no more wood glue sticking to the surface, and also to make the seam a bit smoother. Now it's time to paint the wood, and as usual I'm using linseed oil and fresh brush to apply a generous coat of oil to all of the wooden parts. And then I let this dry overnight. After it's had dried, I'm using my finest sandpaper in the shop, which was like a 400 grit, and then gave it a second coating of linseed oil. And once again, all of the wooden parts, and let it dry overnight. Now it's time to reassemble the rest. The triggering lever actually became so wide, so fat, soaked with all of the oil I put on there. It was a bit too thick to really fit in there anymore, so I ground it off just a bit so it would fit in there nice and snug. And it was a bit fiddly to get it aligned with the hole in the body. Putting the spring back in the top, that will hold the top bolt in place. And screwing the crossbow arms back on with the nuts and bolts. No glue this time, the nuts and bolts hold it in place just as well. And I'm using my pliers here to hold the bolts, so I can tighten them up really snug. Now it's time to make some new rubber strings. I bought the same diameter expander rubbers and some metal clamps, just using my pliers here to clamp them shut. And I'm making new strings, same length as the old ones. And I make 2 of them. Putting them on the crossbow is not hard at all. But as it turns out, these are too short. The new rubber is not as flexible as the old one used to be. So I have to make longer ones. So I make one rubber string that is just a bit longer than the old one, and again clamp it shut. And I try this out immediately. I don't make 2 of them and then try it out just to throw 2 of them away again. No, I try with 1. And this one, perfect length. So I make a second one. Check if they are the same length, just about. And I put both of them on the crossbow. Which finishes this build. Let's put in some bolts and try it out. I'm in my backyard shooting flat from a standing position, and I get a range of about 5 to 10 meters, which ain't too bad for this kind of weapon. And if I shoot both bolts at once, I get a really bad spread actually. But with this crossbow it is to be expected. You get better precision if you fire the bolts one by one. But Larp crossbows are not that accurate anyhow, at least none I had in my hands. And I'm aiming for the camera, shooting the bolts back. Not too bad. This is it for this video. I hope you liked it. Thanks and goodbye.